Hey everyone, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yay! Right, so thank you so much for coming. I'm Lottie, I'm producer at Failbetter Games, and I'm here to talk to you today about producing successful narrative games, which is a title I obviously deeply regret, because it sets the bar very high. So let's just see how we go. So just for anyone who doesn't know, Failbetter are a small indie studio based in London, best known for the games you see on the screen here. Fall in London, a literary RPG browser game. Sunless Sea, our best-selling PC game to date, and Sunless Skies, its spiritual successor, currently out in early access. But the first thing I really want to talk to you guys today is about how you can align the creativity of writing and your passion for narrative with the reality of actually making a game. So the first thing that I want to get into today is the fact that when you are writing for games, you are making a product. So this is not the part where I tell you that you have to crush your dreams and think about KPIs and pull all the soul out of what you love about games. But it is the part of the talk where I suggest that you take an interest in the context of what you're actually making. When you're writing for a game, you're not actually just concerned with the narrative. You're working as part of a multidisciplinary team, all of whom are working together to create this composite game that you're then going to try and sell for money. So if you have an awareness of what's going on and what your actual aim is as a team, trying to make a specific game, you will actually, I think, write a better narrative and be able to do your job better and produce a better product because you actually have an understanding of how you're going to work together with everyone else. So to make this a bit more palatable, taking an example of Sunless Skies, bearing in mind that Skies was in a particularly good position because it's a successor to an existing game, so we kind of had an idea of already what we were going for. But before we even started in pre-production, we had an idea roughly of the kind of themes that we wanted to play with in the game overall. We had an idea of what we as a studio were good at, what our unique selling points were. We knew roughly how much resource we could throw at the project. We had an estimate of how long the project was going to take, and this was not just based on narrative, this was based on all disciplines' estimates. We therefore could work out a rough cost, and I'm sorry, writers are kind of still cheap, so you guys are the 140, not the 550. And we had a rough idea of actually how big the game overall was going to be. So this put us in a really good position, and I'd really encourage all of you to have a similar awareness for the games that you're making right now. So the next thing we're going to do is frighten you. So we all know that making a game is a bit risky. Like the games industry is quite a stressful place to be. And so in this metaphor, actually I'm not going to say that yet, the studio that you work with and the team that you're working with varies. Every single team will be unique, and it ranges from individuals working in one-man micro studios all the way up to AAAs with hundreds of people working on one game. But the one thing they all have in common is that there will always be at least one developer. And in this metaphor, the developer is portrayed by a man playing the banjo. Now this man playing the banjo is looking straight out at you, thank you, is trying to engage with you and is really focused on playing that banjo to the best of his abilities, because that is his job. And we want him to be able to play that banjo really well. But the flip side of that is this banjo player doesn't understand where he is. He doesn't know he's in a boat. He doesn't know if there are holes in the boat. And the moment we ask him to try and think about the context of where he's playing is the moment that he probably is going to be slightly worse at playing the banjo, because now he's got to think about two things. So what you ideally want is somebody whose job is purely just to look out and be aware of the context, somebody who doesn't have to shift roles. So ideally, you want a dedicated production person in your team who can be aware of all these hidden dangers and risks and what's going on, so that banjo players can get on with playing banjo. So the dedicated production guy, the lookout, he has an awareness of where the boat can go. He knows the boat can go forward or backwards, he knows it can't go down or up. He's aware of the constraints of the boat. He knows that how many people can fit in the boat before it sinks. He knows, for example, if it's full of holes. And he also knows where the nearest port is if they get into trouble, because that is his function. Equally, because he's looking out, you can also be aware of the hidden dangers that surround the boat that nobody is looking out for because they're focusing on the banjo. So what happens, however, if reality checks in and you don't actually have a dedicated resource at your disposal? Because I think that's probably the situation that most of us here are in. Does that mean that these dangers disappear? Does that mean that the constraints of the boat disappear? Obviously not. Now what I hope this shows you is we're now aware that these dangers exist, but we can't see them anymore, and that's quite scary. So if you're not aware of the reality of what you're doing when you're making a game, you're basically putting yourself at risk, because the reality stays the same, you're just not looking for it anymore. And if you have a dedicated production resource, fantastic. If you don't, you need to make a specific decision of who in your team is responsible for looking out for these dangers and keeping the boat afloat. And unfortunately, if you are a single developer, this really fun responsibility is on you. So just have an awareness that you need to look out for that. And it can be basically summarised by the fact that production brings the reality of what's going on. It provides the constraints of how many people you can fill the boat with and all this kind of stuff. You then get to bring the creativity once you've established the constraints without sinking the boat. And the result is that you can continue to have a job. And this is great, because you all want to be career games writers, not kind of one-offs who then run out of money and get really sad. The one thing I would say, just before moving on from this slide, is the order of this is super important. I think, as I'm assuming most of you are writers yourselves, or artists, or creatives, so I think your tendency will be to come with the creativity first and then do the reality later. So you'll kind of be like, I've got this great idea and it's going to be the best game ever, and oh my god, I'm going to win awards. And then you're going to kind of want to tack on the reality of like, okay, how much money do I actually have? And if you do that, you're going to have quite a negative relationship with production, because your amazing idea is going to come in and production's going to go, nope, haven't got the money, haven't got the time, haven't got the resource, and you're going to have to like squish your baby into like the reality of what you can actually realistically achieve. And that's not good for you, it's not good for the baby, it's not good for personal experience, for production either. So if you can possibly work out your constraints first and then work within that and spread your creative wings within your limitations, it will be a better experience for everyone, including the game. So, okay, now I'm going to get into, you're now aware of the dangers and you're all afraid. I'm going to go into some of the specifics of the kind of production stuff I think you should be thinking about as creators, as writers. And the first one is, I'm just going to take you briefly through the three main phases of game dev. So the first one is also known as the look around the enterprise phase, or pre-production. And this is when you're meant to ask as many questions as you possibly can. So, for example, if I set out to make something like a VR narrative game based on Animal Farm, pre-production would be the time where I would think about, can I actually make this game? Do I have the skills to develop for VR? Is VR the right platform for my game? Do I have the legal rights to do this? Because you want to answer all these questions before you get into production, where the going gets tough and you want to take as much of production's plate as possible. Because the next phase is production. It is an iterative process of going through the list of stuff that you need to do to get from not having a game to having a game. And this is naturally broken up into some pretty major milestones, things like alpha, beta, early access, launch. And I would encourage you as creators to set your own creative milestones within this. So things like, I want to have 3 chapters done by Christmas, or by the end of the month, I want to get X, Y, and Z complete, or even by the end of the week. Because if you do that, you will feel good about yourselves, because you'll constantly be sort of saying, I've done that, doing really well. But you will also have an idea of where the project is overall from your point of view, within the kind of aegis of actual production. And finally, we have post-launch, which is increasingly important, I think, as the industry moves... Don't do it, Picard! Increasingly important as the industry moves towards more episodic narrative and subscription models and games as a service. So I'm not going to talk much about this, but I would just say be aware of this as an actual phase. Take the lessons you can take as creators in terms of what you've managed to achieve and what people said about it, and learn from it. And then step back, because no one likes the comments. To give you an idea of where where Failbetter's games are, just to illustrate, we've got Sunless Skies currently in early access, so that's pretty clearly in production. We have Sunless Sea, which has now been out now for nearly 3 years, so pretty clearly at the end of post-launch. And we have Fallen London, which is totally bonkers. It is a courteous, free-to-play subscription browser game that we update every month with new content and we're kind of tinkering with, but we're not actually developing. So that exists in a kind of hinterland between production and post-launch. But I've talked about scope. An important thing for you guys to be able to work out is actually how big your game is and how much of a challenge it is before you get into it. So the first thing you need to know about scope is roughly how big your project is. So I gave an example of Skies, knowing from the off we wanted to do 4 regions of roughly 11 ports each. So we knew that the writers at some point were going to have to write something like 44 ports. And that was quite a good jumping off point for lots of other estimates elsewhere. You also need to have an idea of how you're going to actually write that game, what your plan of attack is. And there are 2 things here, really. The first of which is, I think, as writers, people who are passionate about narrative, and I'm assuming are probably quite good at writing, I think your natural response to problems will be to throw more content at the issue. Because it's what you know, it's what you care about, and it's natural to you. And I would encourage you almost never to do that. It is almost never the right thing to do, because the problem tends to get bloated, the problem gets obscured, you have to do more QA, you set an expectation in your player base for really large bits of content. So I'm not saying it's never the right thing to do, but be aware that this is probably a natural reaction, and it's probably something you should try and squash. Also, you can come up with some useful ways of making your writing more efficient. So Sunless Sea, for example, comprises a number of islands, and every time you interact with an island, it tends to follow a similar formula. So you discover an island, you dock at an island, you get its port report, you play a couple of the stories there, and then you leave and come back. And this did two things. Firstly, it allowed our writers to have a kind of formula for the island when they came to write it. So when a writer came to do a new island in Sunless Sea, they weren't starting from scratch. They knew roughly how big it was going to be, they knew roughly it needed these specific elements, they had an idea of how many stories they needed to put there. So this made it easier for them to write. And it also set up expectations in our players, so they kind of knew what to expect, and they kind of got into the rhythm of the game, and they felt they understood it. But really importantly, it then allowed our writers to then break the convention that they had established for dramatic effect as and when they chose. So this was a really powerful tool we had, purely because we had the nous to kind of plan this in advance. So this is something I'd encourage you guys to do too when you're thinking about your narrative games. Really key, you just also need a list of the stuff you're going to do. This doesn't have to be fully accurate, and it will change over production, but what you want is a really coherent idea of actually the tasks you need to do to get from, again, not having a game to having a game, and then you can just pull from this during actual production, so it makes your lives much easier. And you need a clear idea of what is actually possible for you to do individually. So Fallen London, for example, is a text-based browser narrative game with 2D art, in large part because the two people who founded Failbetter, one of them was a writer working as a web developer, and one of them was a 2D artist. So this played to their strengths and made a sensible business decision. Now, I'm not saying that you guys can only write stories and only write games that you're really good at. Obviously, you should try new things and learn and experiment, but you should have an awareness of when you're not playing to your strengths. So, for example, we ported Fallen London to mobile at the start of last year, and we as a studio didn't have much mobile experience. So we were aware of this and made sure we brought on the resource necessary to enhance our skill set. And just have an understanding when you're doing that, because it's liable to make your project more expensive, it's liable to make you write slower, and make everything a bit more complicated. So estimates. So now we've got an idea of what the project is. Now it's time to actually work out roughly how long we think it's going to take and how complicated it is. Now, when I ask people for estimates, I tend to get the same reaction, which is this. People really hate estimates, and this is the hill I'm going to die on. You need to do them. But the good news is that however badly you do them, however badly, honestly, anything that you can estimate, any estimate you give is better than not having anything at all. Because if you do not estimate how long anything is going to take, you have no idea how much it's going to cost, you have no idea how long it's going to take, and you're putting yourself at immense risk, you and your project and everything involved with it. So anything is better than nothing. The first thing I'd suggest that you do is work out the best way of quantifying your specific work and your project. So this might be a case of, I want to estimate in chapters, or I want to be really granular and estimate in sentences. But at Failbetter, we use time estimates just because we want to have a quantity system that works for all disciplines. So we would say something like, this task we think will take 3 days to write, and that's a really clear idea. And then all you do is you do your best guess, and however bad it is, remember this is better than nothing. You then do that task, and you then compare it with how long it actually took you to do. And what you'll find is over the course of the project, your estimates will get more and more accurate as you get a feel for it, and you work out what kind of tasks you tend to underestimate and what kind of tasks you tend to overestimate. So it will get better, and you do have to do them. And once you've got this, now you're in a really good position. Now you can actually budget. In my experience, the majority of budgets go on the people making the game, which feels good. So a really simple formula is just work out how many people are involved, work out how long they're going to be involved for, and work out how much they cost you, and times that all together, and you get a rough idea of actually how much it's going to cost as a project. Now you need to make sure that you include things like freelancers and rent and software. And I'd also encourage you to add a bit of contingency. A rule of thumb is about 10 to 20% contingency, because there will always be things that you forget. But it's much better to have them budgeted somewhere than kind of realise halfway through that you need an extra 50 grand. And if you do this, you should end up with a table that looks something like this, which clearly delineates where the money's going and how much it adds up to. And you will have a really scary yellow number at the bottom, which is your budget for the project. Now, in my experience, the first time anyone sees this yellow number is a horrible moment. It is always higher than you think it's going to be. And the immediate human reaction to this is to go back immediately to the budget and try and make it lower. To think, actually, I could do that in half the time, or I don't need that guy, or whatever. And I would ask you not to do that, because you will be tempted, and you are lying to yourself. Again, this is an example of there being a hidden danger, and you just closing your eyes to it. It doesn't change the reality unless you actually de-scope. It will just make you feel better, and then make you crash and burn when you're in production. Just as an illustration, the pie chart on the right is from the Sunless Skies Kickstarter page, which gives you an idea of the breakdown. And again, you can see that even for a studio that prides itself on being a narrative-led studio, we're really proud of our art, writing is just a small bit of that pie. So again, just have an awareness of the context of actually what you're trying to achieve. Writing is not the full sum of it. Okay, so now I'm just going to very quickly whiz through an example of actually how Failbetter gets stuff done, having burbled on about all the kind of theoreticals. So what you're looking at here is a top-down view of the Reach, which is the first region of Sunless Skies, and you can currently play this in early access. So you can see that the world is divided into segments, and in each segment are 1 or 2 ports. So you can see overall in these pink circles we have our 11 ports that we estimated at the start of the project. Now, for the sake of argument, I'm going to take this port, which is the Traitor's Wood port, which is a beautiful elegiac port written by our lovely writer James. And I'm going to take you through how we wrote this. So we knew that we wanted 11 ports in the overall region. We estimated that 1 port would take 1 writer about 5 days to complete. And this told me that if I had 3 writers working full-time on the project, the whole Reach, the content for the Reach, would take about 20 days to complete. So this is really good for me in terms of the context of what's going on in the game. What the writer actually cares about, though, is they only care about that 5-day estimate. So this is another great example of production giving really clear constraints that are very simple to understand, and the creators can then go away and do their magic within this box without worrying about everything exploding. So what this is the actual process by which Failbetter writes. I may have replaced the team with the dream team, obviously, of Christopher Marlowe, Terry Pratchett, and the Beowulf poet. But taking the example of Traitor's Wood, again, we knew we had 5 days to do it in. We knew what it was. We knew that it was one of 11 ports in the Reach, so we had an idea of the themes and how big it was and where it was fitting in. And the first thing that happens is Christopher comes to the content team and says, I want to write a port about trees. And Terry Pratchett, who is acting as the sign-off in this example, says, yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that fits in with the themes of what we're trying to achieve narratively overall. So go ahead. So Christopher goes ahead and writes all the content needed for this port, so the full shebang. And over the course of this writing, Terry Pratchett again checks in to make sure that this is progressing in the way he was expecting and it makes sense. At which point, it's handed over to a deliberately third party. So it goes over to the Beowulf poet, because now what we're testing is how it actually plays in-game. We're now looking from the user's perspective. So the Beowulf poet will go in and play, and he's looking for mechanical bugs, and does it make sense to the player? Do they know what they're doing? Are the resources given out as they should be? And he makes a bunch of notes. And again, Terry comes back in just for a final overview, and he says, yeah, thematically this is exactly what I was expecting. You made a couple of typos. Why don't you change this prose to be a bit more sparkly? And both those notes go back to Christopher, who then makes his final edits, and the port is complete. So when I say complete, is a note, completion is a binary state. If somebody says that something is done but, it is not done. And the reason for this is when I talk about something being done or complete, what I mean is, do I ever have to think about it again? Because you've got that big list of stuff you need to get done, so you want to get as much of that off your plate properly as you can, so you can worry about the rest of the stuff properly and you can focus on it. So do remember that if you ever have to think about it again, it's not done. So just be aware of that. This process is also a great example of tracking. Like I said earlier in the talk, you need to have an idea of where your stuff is. So, for example, if I said to Christopher Marlowe, where is Traitor's Wood, and he said it's in Mech QA, that would immediately tell me lots of things. He would say that, it had been pitched and signed off, it had been written and signed off, and it would give me an idea of how much longer he was going to need before it was fully complete. So again, really positive. And finally, just an awareness that things will go wrong. This process, I think, makes it look a bit like it's super easy, and we all know that it's not. But just know that you should never, ever, ever have to crunch. If there are problems, you just need to talk about it, you need to work out solutions, but there are always solutions. And if you ever crunch, it is a failure of everything that we stand for, so never do it. Right, so I'm running out of time. So just some top tips to recap what I was saying. The first of which is remember that creativity and reality are best friends, and they will make you and your product better. Be aware of the constraints and dangers of what you're doing, because it is risky, and you can avoid the risks and dangers if you're aware of them. Have an understanding of the context of what you're trying to do. Remember that narrative is what you love most in the world, but it is not the sum total of the game that you're making. And just have an awareness that you will always want to throw more content at the problem, and that is not what you should be doing. You should be writing smart, not lots. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for questions, if there are any.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned about the dangers that surround game development. What would you say are some of the most common ones that a person new to the industry might not be aware of?
I think running out of money is a big one, because it's really hard to work out budgets in advance, and there's not that much you can do if you kind of burn through it and then you're stuck. I would say another big one is not being aware that you're not aware of potential issues. So I see a lot of people who feel that everything's going swimmingly, so they don't need to worry about anything. But what you want to do is avoid problems before they're problems, not wait for them to appear and then think of a cunning solution to fix them. So I think those are the two biggies.
You mentioned one of the dangers of when you encounter a problem, it's very tempting to throw more content at it, and that you shouldn't do that.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could think of any specific examples of encountering that and how you solved it.
So, for example, if you are, I don't know, halfway through writing a story and you feel that it's not having the effect that you want on the player, you're really aiming for a specific emotional effect on the player, and it's not happening. I think because writers feel most confident with writing, they would tend to either add extra context add extra words which describe more of the problem, or add extra options to give players more avenues of expressing their opinions. And that's fine. I mean, I think that probably would address the problem, but it doesn't address it efficiently. And it also doesn't really engage with the original problem, which is that what you have right now isn't doing the job that you want it to do. So it's kind of adding layers onto an issue rather than actually thinking, there is a problem here, let's work out what that is and how we can fix it.
Can you think of any examples of how you fixed such a problem?
I can't, because I don't want to be like, this person did this and that was rubbish. But talk to me later and maybe we can talk.
Do you have any specific project management tools that you think apply particularly well to game development?
I do. I'm worried that everyone's going to think I'm sponsored by them. But we use a software called Hack and Plan, which is the only game development software that I've seen specifically designed for games, which is just a really simple Kanban board and task list. So Kanban board, for those of us who don't know, is just like columns of like to do, doing, done, and it's a really simple visual representation of what's in progress and kind of what's left to do. But I think that's great.
It probably depends on studio size, but from a producer's perspective, at what point do you escalate a problem to like senior executive level?
That's really hard. I mean, I personally would much rather fix the problem myself than say, it doesn't work. And I also think that when you escalate, it tends to imply fault a bit, and it tends to make it probably bigger and people get a bit defensive. And like I said, I think there is a problem with creativity and production having a slightly antagonistic relationship anyway. So for me, I would always try and work it out with communication and just talk to people and try and work out specifically what the issue is, and then get people to suggest their own solutions rather than coming in and saying, you should do this. Because also, I'm not a writer, so if I'm solving a narrative issue, I want the writers to tell me what they think are best, because they'll know more. And only if we've exhausted the possibilities of what they can think of and what I can think of, would I then go and say, this is a big issue. Any more? Two more questions, okay. So, yes.
Your excellent dev setup featuring Christopher Marlowe, Terry Pratchett and Bill Boyd.
The dream team, right?
Yes. Do you have any advice on how to work a pipeline like that when the dev team, the entirety of the dev team is you and possibly your cat?
Do you have any other person engaging with your work at all? Do you have an editor? Do you have a friend that looks at it occasionally, like, or is it very much just you?
Only if I write them with
Then I think that the key thing for you is to make sure that you have really clear distinction between different phases. Because if you're having to put on lots of different hats, you never want to have multiple hats on at once. You'll look like an idiot. So I think just making sure that there are really, really clear phases of exactly what the process is before you move on is probably the best bet, but that is a tricky one. And one more question, if we have any. Yes.
How do you go about disaster planning, particularly in narrative games where, like, maybe you've written a game where your plot relies on pretty much every piece you've got in there, and then suddenly the dev leaves or your release date gets pulled back or something like that?
Okay, well, the best practice would be to, before you get into writing it, you'd come up with like a risk document, which would say, here are the things that I think are likely to happen, here are the things that I think are unlikely to happen, but would be very severe if they do. And the idea is that you think about what you would do in these situations before you're in the situation, so when everything goes wrong, you don't have to suddenly be like, oh my god, everything's on fire, how do I fix it? You can go, oh, well, I wrote this in chapter B of my risk document, so I can go there and my sensible self told me what to do. Obviously, in reality, that rarely happens, but I think just having an awareness that everything is surmountable, even if a dev leaves and suddenly your entire plan has to change. I mean, you planned out this game in the first place, you thought of all the interlinking bits, you can figure a solution out. So I think, again, just stepping back and knowing that there is a solution that isn't just, we have to crunch loads. So I'm afraid it's not particularly useful for specific examples, but I think you just have to basically take it as it comes. I know that you can fix it. Anyway, I think I'm out of time, so thank you so much.